Today's reading begins in 2 Kings, chapter 10, starting in verse 32. In those days the Lord began to cut away parts of Israel, and Hazael struck them in all the borders of Israel, from the Jordan eastward, all the land of Gilead, the Gadites and the Reubenites, and the Manassites, from Oyor, which is by the valley of the Arnon, even Gilead and Bashan. Now the rest of the acts of Jehu, and all that he did, and all his might, aren't they written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel? Jehu slept with his fathers, and they buried him in Samaria. Jehoahaz his son reigned in his place. The time that Jehu reigned over Israel in Samaria was 28 years. Now when Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she arose and destroyed all the royal offspring. But Jehosheba, the daughter of King Joram, sister of Ahaziah, took Joash, the son of Ahaziah, and stole him away from amongst the king's sons who were slain, even him and his nurse, and put them in the bedroom, and they hid him from Athaliah, so that he was not slain. He was with her hidden in the Lord's house 6 years, while Athaliah reigned over the land. In the 7th year, Jehoiada sent and fetched the captains over hundreds of the Kerites and of the guard, and brought them to him into the Lord's house. And he made a covenant with them, and made a covenant with them in the Lord's house, and showed them the king's son. He commanded them, saying, "This is what you must do. 1/3 of you who come in on the Sabbath shall be keepers of the watch of the king's house. 1/3 of you shall be at the gate, sir, and 1/3 of you at the gate behind the guard. So you shall keep the watch of the house, and be a barrier. The 2 companies of you, even all who go out on the Sabbath, shall keep the watch of the Lord's house around the king. You shall surround the king, every man with his weapons in his hand, and he who comes within the ranks, let him be slain. Be with the king when he goes out, and when he comes in." The captains over hundreds did according to all that Jehoiada the priest commanded, and they each took his men, those who were to come in on the Sabbath with those who were to go out on the Sabbath, and came to Jehoiada the priest. The priest delivered to the captains over hundreds the spears and shields that had been King David's, which were in the Lord's house. The guard stood, every man with his weapons in his hand, from the right side of the house to the left side of the house, along by the altar and the house, around the king. Then he brought out the king's son, and put the crown on him, and gave him the covenant, and they made him king, and anointed him, and they clapped their hands, and said, "Long live the king!" When Athaliah heard the noise of the guard and of the people, she came to the people into the Lord's house, and she looked, and behold, the king stood by the pillar, as the tradition was, with the captains and the trumpets by the king, and all the people of the land rejoiced, and blew trumpets. Then Athaliah tore her clothes, and cried, "Treason! Treason!" Jehoiada the priest commanded the captains of hundreds who were set over the army, and said to them, "Bring her out between the ranks. Kill anyone who follows her with a sword." For the priest said, "Don't let her be slain in the Lord's house." So they seized her, and she went by the way of the horse's entry to the king's house, and she was slain there. Jehoiada made a covenant between the Lord and the king and the people, that they should be the Lord's people, also between the king and the people. All the people of the land went to the house of Baal and broke it down. They broke his altars and his images in pieces thoroughly, and killed Mattan the priest of Baal before the altars. The priest appointed officers over the Lord's house. He took the captains over hundreds, and the Kerites, and the guard, and all the people of the land, and they brought down the king from the Lord's house, and came by the way of the gate of the guard to the king's house. He sat on the throne of the kings. So all the people of the land rejoiced, and the city was quiet. They had slain Athaliah with a sword at the king's house. Jehoash was 7 years old when he began to reign. Jehoash began to reign in the 7th year of Jehu, and he reigned 40 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Zibiah of Beersheba. Jehoash did that which was right in the Lord's eyes all his days in which Jehoiada the priest instructed him. However, the high places were not taken away. The people still sacrificed and burned incense in the high places. Jehoash said to the priests, "All the money of the holy things that is brought into the Lord's house, in current money, the money of the people for whom each man is evaluated, and all the money that it comes into any man's heart to bring into the Lord's house, let the priests take it to them, each man from his donor, and they shall repair the damage to the house, wherever any damage is found. But it was so, that in the 23rd year of King Jehoash the priests had not repaired the damage to the house. Then King Jehoash called for Jehoiada the priest, and for the other priests, and said to them, Why aren't you repairing the damage to the house? Now therefore take no more money from your treasurers, but deliver it for repair of the damage to the house. The priests consented that they should take no more money from the people, and not repair the damage to the house. But Jehoiada the priest took a chest, and bored a hole in its lid, and set it beside the altar, on the right side as one comes into the Lord's house. And the priests who kept the threshold put all the money that was brought into the Lord's house into it. When they saw that there was much money in the chest, the king's scribe and the high priest came up, and they put it in bags, and counted the money that was found in the Lord's house. They gave the money that was weighed out into the hands of those who did the work, who had the oversight of the Lord's house, and they paid it out to the carpenters and the builders who worked on the Lord's house, and to the masons and the stone cutters, and for buying timber and cut stone to repair the damage to the Lord's house, and for all that was laid out for the house to repair it. But there were not made for the Lord's house cups of silver, snuffers, basins, trumpets, any vessels of gold or vessels of silver, of the money that was brought into the Lord's house, for they gave that to those who did the work, and repaired the Lord's house with it. Moreover, they didn't demand an accounting from the men into whose hand they delivered the money, to give to those who did the work, for they dealt faithfully. The money for the trespass offerings and the money for the sin offerings was not brought into the Lord's house. It was the priests. Then Hazael, king of Syria, went up and fought against Gath, and took it. And Hazael set his face to go up to Jerusalem. Jehoash, king of Judah, took all the holy things that Jehoshaphat and Jehoram and Ahaziah, his fathers, kings of Judah, had dedicated, and his own holy things, and all the gold that was found in the treasures of the Lord's house, and of the king's house, and sent it to Hazael, king of Syria, and he went away from Jerusalem. Now the rest of the acts of Joash, and all that he did, aren't they written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? His servants arose and made a conspiracy, and struck Joash at the house of Milo, on the way that goes down to Silla. For Jozachar the son of Shemaeth, and Jehozabad the son of Shomer, his servants, struck him, and he died. And they buried him with his fathers in David's city, and Amaziah his son reigned in his place. The book of Acts, chapter 18, starting in verse 1. After these things, Paul departed from Athens, and came to Corinth. He found a certain Jew named Aquila, a man of Pontus by race, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome. He came to them, and because he practiced the same trade, he lived with them and worked, for by trade they were tent makers. He reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath, and persuaded Jews and Greeks. When Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul was compelled by the Spirit, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. When they opposed him and blasphemed, he shook out his clothing, and said to them, Your blood be on your own heads. I am clean. From now on I will go to the Gentiles. He departed there, and went into the house of a certain man named Justus, one who worshipped God, whose house was next door to the synagogue. Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed in the Lord with all his house. Many of the Corinthians, when they heard, believed and were baptized. The Lord said to Paul in the night by a vision, Don't be afraid, but speak, and don't be silent, for I am with you, and no one will attack you to harm you, for I have many people in the city. He lived there 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God amongst them. But when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews with one accord rose up against Paul, and brought him before the judgment seat, saying, This man persuades men to worship God contrary to the law. But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, If indeed it were a matter of wrong or of wicked crime, you Jews, it would be reasonable that I should bear with you. But if they are questions about words and names and your own law, look to it yourselves, for I don't want to be a judge of these matters. So he drove them from the judgment seat. Then all the Greeks seized Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him before the judgment seat. Gallio didn't care about any of these things. Paul, having stayed after this many more days, took his leave of the brothers, and sailed from there for Syria, together with Priscilla and Aquila. He shaved his head in Cenchrea, for he had a vow. He came to Ephesus, and he left them there, but he himself entered into the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. When they asked him to stay with them a longer time, he declined, but taking his leave of them, he said, I must by all means keep this coming feast in Jerusalem, but I will return again to you if God wills. Then he set sail from Ephesus. When he had landed at Caesarea, he went up and greeted the assembly, and went down to Antioch. Psalm 145, starting in verse 1. I will exalt you, my God, the King. I will praise your name forever and ever. Every day I will praise you. I will extol your name forever and ever. Great is the Lord, and greatly to be praised. His greatness is unsearchable. One generation will commend your works to another, and will declare your mighty acts. I will meditate on the glorious majesty of your honor, on your wondrous works. Men will speak of the might of your awesome acts. I will declare your greatness. They will utter the memory of your great goodness, and will sing of your righteousness. The Lord is gracious, merciful, slow to anger, and of great loving kindness. The Lord is good to all. His tender mercies are over all his works. All your works will give thanks to you, Lord. Your saints will extol you. They will speak of the glory of your kingdom, and talk about your power, to make known to the sons of men his mighty acts, the glory of the majesty of his kingdom. Your kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. Your dominion endures throughout all generations. The Lord is faithful in all his words, and loving in all his deeds. The Lord upholds all who fall, and raises up all those who are bowed down. The eyes of all wait for you. You give them their food in due season. You open your hand, and satisfy the desire of every living thing. The Lord is righteous in all his ways, and gracious in all his works. The Lord is near to all those who call on him, to all who call on him in truth. He will fulfill the desire of those who fear him. He also will hear their cry, and will save them. The Lord preserves all those who love him, but he will destroy all the wicked. My mouth will speak the praise of the Lord. Let all flesh bless his holy name forever and ever. Proverbs chapter 18, verse 1. A man who isolates himself pursues selfishness and defies all sound judgment.